During the hottest week of summer, Eli Mercer paid an excavator to deepen a drainage wash that had not carried water in years. His stock well was failing, and neighbors called the job a waste. Then the bucket broke through blue-gray clay. Clear water began threading into the cut. The question was not whether Eli had found water. It was whether there was enough of it to matter. Eli had bought the place at a county auction 9 months earlier, a little over 150 acres of thin pasture, rusted corrals, failing fence, and a shallow stock well that had looked adequate on paper. The price was low because the place had been neglected. Eli thought he could make the numbers work if he kept the herd small and did most of the repairs himself. That plan had been reasonable before the third hard summer arrived. By July, the grass made a dry whisper under his boots. The stock well needed longer and longer to recover after each pumping cycle. 2 neighboring ranches had already begun hauling water. One family had sold part of its herd because there was no sense buying feed for cattle they could not reliably water. Eli knew that sequence too well. For 7 years, he had serviced rural pumps and stock water systems across the high plains. He had pulled burned motors from deep wells, replaced cracked pressure lines, and watched ranchers spend money chasing water that was no longer where it used to be. He had learned that the ground rarely announced a problem in a dramatic way. Most of the time, it offered small clues first. The clue on his place was a dry wash behind the north pasture. The wash itself looked worthless. It was shallow, stony, and choked with dust, but one narrow strip along its upper bank stayed darker than the ground around it. Tough sedge grew there after everything else had browned. When Eli pushed a steel probe through the hard surface late one afternoon, the tip came back wet and noticeably cool. There had been no rain for weeks. Hank Voss, who ran cattle across the western fence, had an explanation. "Low ground holds damp," he said. "Doesn't mean you've got water. Means you've got mud." Hank was not being cruel. In Briar County, drought had made people suspicious of hope. Every year somebody paid for a deeper hole, a longer pipe, or a new promise from a man with a drilling rig. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the only thing that came up was a bill. Eli did not think the damp strip proved anything either. But he noticed something else. The darkest soil did not sit at the bottom of the wash. It ran along one side, slightly above it, following the slope like a buried seam. If rainwater were simply collecting in the low spot, that made no sense. So he hired a local excavator for one day, not to drill a well, but to open the old drainage cut and see what the soil was doing underneath. That was the part everybody laughed about. "You're digging a ditch in a drought," Hank called from the fence as the machine arrived. "At least wait for rain so it can disappoint you properly." Eli lifted a hand and kept marking the cut. The first attempt looked like proof that Hank was right. The excavator opened the lowest section of the wash. Black water seeped into the bottom, carrying so much silt that it looked like coffee. Eli set a small pump in the hole. Within an hour, the water was gone. The operator leaned on the cab and looked down at the slick mud. "There's your spring," he said. "Mud?" Eli stood there longer than he wanted to admit. He had spent money he could not easily replace. His own well was weakening. A load of hay had cost more that week than he had budgeted for the month. The sensible move was to backfill the cut, send the machine home, and stop trying to read meaning into a patch of damp grass. Then he saw a thin shine on the north wall of the trench, not at the bottom, halfway up. Water was moving sideways through a narrow band of rounded gravel trapped between layers of clay. It was slow, but it was still moving after the bottom had been pumped dry. Eli crouched at the edge and watched for nearly 20 minutes. The muddy basin below did not refill evenly. The water kept entering from that same strip. He canceled the deeper cut. Instead, He called the Briar Soil and Water Office and asked for someone to look at the slope before he opened any more ground. 2 days later, a field technician walked the wash with him. They traced the damp band uphill, away from the place Eli had first dug. The technician would not call it a usable spring yet. A wet seam could disappear under pumping. It could carry minerals that made it unsuitable for stock. It could be seasonal. It could be nothing more than stored moisture moving slowly through gravel after older rains. So they treated it as a question, not an answer. A second test cut was made farther upslope, with the bank opened wide enough to stay stable. This time they did not chase the lowest point. They exposed the gravel layer where it met a hard clay lens. Cold water began to gather there almost immediately. It did not gush. It did not shoot into the air. It simply kept coming. Over the next couple of weeks, Eli worked with a groundwater consultant and a local lab. They watched the recovery after controlled draws. They tested the water. They checked how the flow changed through the hottest part of the day. The explanation was less spectacular than the rumors that had already started moving through town, but far more useful. A water-bearing layer beneath the slope was feeding a natural spring outlet where gravel met clay. At some point, years of grading and sediment had buried the outlet. The water had not vanished. It had been spreading underground through the wash, showing itself only as that stubborn ribbon of damp soil. The source was steady enough to support livestock water if it was captured carefully and used within limits. It was not enough to irrigate 150 acres. It was not permission to double the herd. And nobody could promise what several more years of drought would do to it. Those limits were the reason Eli trusted the answer. He installed a proper collection point with professional help and routed the flow into a covered storage tank. A meter let him see what he was actually using. Float valves stopped troughs from overflowing. For the first time that summer, his cattle could drink without the shallow well cycling until it overheated. That alone would have justified the digging. Then Hank's well failed. It did not fail dramatically. The pump still ran. The tank simply recovered slower each day until Hank was hauling water before sunrise and again after dark. One evening he pulled his truck beside Eli's gate and left the engine running. "Tell me what you'd charge," he said. Eli knew what he meant. Water had become expensive enough that a man with a reliable source could name a price and probably get it. Eli also knew the spring was not endless. Selling as much as people wanted would have been the fastest way to turn a useful source into another exhausted one. So he offered Hank a different deal. If the tested flow held, they would build one shared storage point near the three-way fence corner. Hank would bring his trencher. Another neighbor would contribute pipe and fittings. Eli would contribute the spring water. All three operations would agree to a fixed draw schedule, meters, and no herd expansion based on the new source. Hank looked at him for a moment. "I thought you were digging a ditch," he said. "So did I," Eli answered. The work took most of a week. They ran a low-pressure line from Eli's storage system to a larger tank at the fence junction. They repaired 2 stretches of old fence while the trench was open. They set the trough valve so nobody could forget a hose and lose a night's worth of water into dry soil. By the time the shared tank came online, the pasture was still brown. That mattered. Water did not grow grass. It did not lower hay prices. It did not erase the drought. One of the 3 ranches still sold cattle because there was not enough forage to justify keeping them all. But after the line was finished, water was no longer the reason those ranches had to make the next cut. The tanker trip stopped. Hank kept his core breeding cows. Eli stopped running his shallow well to the edge of failure. The third family could spend its fuel money on feed instead of hauling water back and forth over county roads. And the old wash never became a creek. From the road, it still looked like a dry scar crossing a piece of tired pasture. Most people driving by would never have guessed that a narrow layer beneath that slope was feeding 3 ranches at a rate small enough to respect and large enough to matter. Late in the season, Eli walked up to the first muddy cut, the one that had looked like a mistake. He could still see where the excavator teeth had marked the clay. The hole had been reshaped and stabilized, but he left one patch of the old bank exposed. The gravel seam was there if you knew where to look. Below the ridge, the float in the shared tank rose to its stop and clicked shut.